This is episode 405 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm DJ Guba, Assistant Professor of History at Bard Early College, Baltimore, and I'm the author of the paper Acts from History, Executioners in Early Modern Europe. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
When Shakespeare wrote the play Hamlet, he gave the melancholy Dane two university friends with peculiarly Danish names, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Those are pronounced differently in Danish, but you know the people I'm talking about. For many centuries, audiences have assumed that these were simply fictional characters that Shakespeare made up. But history tells us that Frederik Rosencrantz and Knud Gyldenstierne were real men. They were Danish, and they traveled to England during Shakespeare's lifetime as part of an official embassy from the Danish court. Their visit took place during a fascinating moment of cultural diplomacy. King James VI of Scotland's marriage alliance with Denmark, his 1589 voyage to meet Anna of Denmark, and the exchanges of royal gifts that linked these two kingdoms. This same period saw Tycho Brahe's astronomical fame rise across Europe. The University of Wittenberg was flourishing as an intellectual hub, and England's awareness of the Dutch Golden Age was beginning to take shape. Today, we'll explore all of these threads of English and Danish history, as well as all the details that seem to have been packed into Shakespeare's Hamlet with Paul Lockhart. Paul is professor of history and Dre Gould Distinguished Professor of Research at Wright State University in Ohio, here in the United States, and he has published 7 singular author books, one of which was Denmark 1513 to 1660, The Rise and Decline of the Renaissance Monarchy. You can see more of his publications and links to his current work in the show notes for today's episode. Paul joins us today to help us explore the story of the two real courtiers whose names, and perhaps even their personalities, live on in one of Shakespeare's most famous plays. Before we dive into our conversation today, I want to remind you that there are visual history bonuses related to today's conversation that you can scroll through while you're listening to the show. These are available for members of That Shakespeare Life, and this week it includes portraits and heraldic arms of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, maps of the diplomatic routes between Denmark, Scotland, and England, along with more information on Wittenberg University from the late 16th century, and even a hand-illustrated print by me of Elsinore Castle. These are available as in our downloadable members library there. So if you'd like to access all of these extras, just click Access the Extras at our podcast page today. That's at CassidyCash.com/episode 405. Again, that's CassidyCash.com/EP 405. Click Access the Extras and you can scroll through all the bonuses while you listen to the show. And now let's dive into the history. Hello, Paul. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, Cassidy. Thanks for having me.
I think most of our listeners will be surprised to learn that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern were real people. I know it was thrilling to me to realize that that was so. Who were these people in real life?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, I should back up and say, as an historian, to a certain extent, I have to rain a little bit on parades. I mean, that's part of my job. But we do know something about them. Not a lot, and I think we can identify with reasonable certainty who Rosencrantz and Guildenstern were, and likely they were. Keeping in mind that Rosenkrantz and Gyldenstierne are two of the most common aristocratic family names, and not just in Denmark but throughout Scandinavia. I mean, these are inter-Scandinavian names, but within the Kingdom of Denmark and its affiliated lands, including Norway, these names are quite common. However, the evidence seems to point to Frederik Holgersen Rosenkrantz and Knud Henriksen Gyldenstierne as being the candidates for these roles.
And for the sake of us that have never pronounced it that way in our lives, I hope you'll forgive me if I leave the correct pronunciation to you and call them Rosencrantz and Guildenstern with no offense. They're not only real people, though, but is it accurate that they visited London during Shakespeare's lifetime? And if that actually happened, tell us what that visit was like.
Well, and there's a yes with a but
Of
to this
course.
one. Now, first I should point out that recently there has been some attention paid to the identities of these men. By recently, I mean within the past 2 decades, and these are based primarily on the writings of an amateur Danish historian a little more than a century ago, Palle Rosencrantz, who wrote about this in 1910 in a Danish literary magazine. To a certain extent, Palle Rosencrantz embellished what the sources actually tell us about Frederik Rosencrantz and Knud Gyldenstierne. So we know they were in England. We don't know a great deal much more beyond that, unfortunately. What we do know is that these two young men, and they're quite young, Rosencrantz would have been, he was born in 1571, so if he was in England in 1592, which is what we surmise, he would have been at most 21 years old, and Gyldenstierne, 17. These were not experienced Danish diplomats. They're still quite young men, both recently having gone through the common aristocratic ritual of the Grand Tour, where they visited courts and universities throughout Europe for several years. In Rosencrantz's case, since the time he was 9 years old. We know that they were in England in 1592. They're in a company of another young aristocrat named Mogens Ulfeldt, and that at some point they're in Scotland, and at some point they go to England. Details about a court visit, we simply don't have those. And the fact of the matter is, although the recent articles and book mentions of Rosencrantz and Guildenstierne indicate they were on a diplomatic mission, there's simply nothing in the archival record to suggest this. They were young men likely accompanying a diplomatic mission, but they themselves were not diplomats. And so their appearance in England might have attracted some attention, especially if they were interesting individuals. But their official role was not a big one, if one at all. So in short, we don't really know what they saw in London, who saw them, what they actually did. We know they were in England at the same time and they were friends.
The Rosencrantz that wrote about it in 1910, was that person related to these people? Was that the impetus for, hey, let's find out more about them? Or is that just a coincidence that they had a similar name?
He did, in fact, claim to be a descendant.
Okay.
Now, and I have not traced that myself. I mean, Frederik Rosencrantz, because Frederik Rosencrantz, by the way, intersects with my own work. When he gets in trouble in Denmark in the 1590s, it's largely because of a run-in he has with the father of a young aristocratic woman, and that father is somebody who interests me a great deal. And that's really his only significant claim to fame, but he never married and never had, the only child he had was the illegitimate child he had with Ribor Brockenhus in the 1590s. So as to whether, I assume Palle Rosencrantz did the genealogy, but he did in fact claim to be a descendant.
Now, at least one of these men was part of a royal visit that James VI made to Norway and Denmark in 1589, when the king was given gifts, I believe, by Gyldenstierne. Now, I defer to you for the details here, but tell us about this connection. Did James the /1 of England go to Norway and Denmark, and who did he meet there, and what gifts did they give each other for this trip?
Good question, and that's a very important meeting. Now, first of all, in here, I'm sorry to disappoint. There is a Gyldenstierne who, in fact, meets with James in Norway, and I'll get to the background of that. But it is not Knud Gyldenstierne. It is not the same man who you see in England in 1592. It's a different Gyldenstierne. Now, the occasion of the meeting was the very complicated process of marrying James VI to Anna of Denmark, the daughter of the late King Frederik II and the sister of the soon-to-be King Christian IV, probably the most famous king in Danish history, and of course, consequently, James VI and first brother-in-law. This was a prime prime alliance for all sorts of reasons, among the fact that both England and Denmark saw themselves as really the principal Protestant powers in Europe at the point. In Scotland, obviously, in the case of James, it's a very important marriage alliance in that sense. But the wedding is carried out by proxy at Kronborg Castle at Helsingør, and we better know this. Shakespeare readers undoubtedly know this better as Elsinore Castle, which is technically called Kronborg. The wedding is held there in proxy. In other words, there is a Danish stand-in for James. And then Anna was to, of course, travel to Scotland to meet with James. things were very complicated at that point. Anna's the squadron of Royal Danish warships escorting Anna to Scotland gets caught in a seemingly a nasty perpetual storm and is barely able to make any headway. Ultimately, this is blamed on witchcraft, both in Scotland and in Denmark. It seems that witches were firmly against this wedding for some reason. James, when hearing about the troubles that Anna was facing, ends up going to Oslo to meet with her after she, in fact, had put into Norway. And the actual wedding itself of James to Anna was, in fact, consecrated at the bishop's palace in Oslo in November of 1589. And that's not the end of the festivities. In December, James and Anna travel to Denmark and stay there well through most of the spring, in fact. So where James meets a number of famous Danes and makes something of a social splash. It's during that trip, specifically after the wedding in Oslo, that James meets with a number of, I not say high-ranking officials, but the king's foremost representatives in Norway. First among them would have been Axel Knudsen Gyldenstierne. So another Gyldenstierne, but not directly related to Knud Gyldenstierne, the one we'll see in England in 1592. He was both stadholder, essentially the king's governor in Norway, and what we call Lensman, or the fief holder of Akershus Castle, which was the primary royal residence in Oslo. So in other words, a really high-ranking official. He and James did meet, and in fact, James made a gift to him and to Tycho Brahe, another Danish aristocrat, of silver plate. So we know that James gave gifts to a Gyldenstierne. It just wasn't the same Gyldenstierne.
Do you think that all of these, I mean, the Gyldenstierne name floating around so much, with there being this many touch points to that name, does that play into why it was one of the ones that Shakespeare thought, hey, maybe we should base, our character, when we say he based it on the real Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, did he base it on these two people, or was he just basing it on the fact that he kept running into these names when hearing about James's travels and his wedding and all the different touch points that this name seems to show up?
That's a really good question. And and as an historian, I tend to be kind of conservative where it comes to making, big logical leaps. Clearly, if anyone paid any attention to Anglo-Danish affairs, then, these are names that would pop up a lot, obviously Gyldenstierne and Rosenkrantz. Now, for somebody really familiar with Danish politics at the time, they're not the foremost names. I mean, it's Niels Kos and Hack Ulfstand and people like that who were at the center of the regency that ruled Denmark in between the death of Frederik II in 1588 and the coronation of Christian IV in 1596. Again, they're such prominent names. And as you point out, there are people with English connections or people who are English who are continuously running into Rosencrantz and Guildenstiernes, including in the 1592 period when those two particular men, when Frederik Rosencrantz and Knud Gyldenstierne were both in England. And one wonders if they did in fact make some kind of scene, there's something to attract attention to them, because they're, at this point, while they both had significant careers ahead of them to an extent, till especially in Frederik's case, it was cut short by his own lack of judgment, that they're still, they're not especially well known at that point. They're just too young for that. My thought has always been, and really until I became familiar with Paolo Rosenkrantz's article from 1910, my thought was, well, these are two Danish names that literate, world-aware English people would have known, or likely would have known. Just similar to having Hamlet take place at Elsinore. I mean, Helsingør was better known to English people than Copenhagen, because this is where English ships had to stop to pay their duties going into or out of the Baltic. Any English mariner knew of Elsinore, the Danish place that English people would have known of.
What was the political relationship between England and Denmark/Norway that made this connection happening? I mean, you're talking about trade happening there pretty consistently, and you mentioned earlier that they both saw themselves as part of the principal trio, if you will, England, Scotland, and Denmark and Norway, of being the Protestant representatives in this area of the world. But what was going on in a geopolitical sense between the two of them? You hit on the two main things there. I'll work with those. And it really comes down to trade and Protestant identity, certainly at this point. So the
trade issue. We often tend to forget, and this is something when I teach Scandinavian history, I point out the Oldenburg monarchy, as it was between 1536 and 1660, is nothing like Denmark today. It's much, 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 much larger, because it includes not only Denmark as it exists today, but Norway as it existed before 1660. In other words, before Norway lost large chunks of land to Sweden, the Scanian lands along the southern Swedish coast that we sometimes simply call Scania, Iceland, claims to Greenland already are commonplace, plus Denmark has possessions in northern Germany. So it's a large state. In terms of square mileage, it's significantly larger than England, but significantly more sparsely populated. I mean, it is a sparsely populated kingdom. But the thing that really made Denmark significant, and in the eyes of diplomats, say between 1550 and 1630 or so, Denmark was routinely seen as the great Protestant power. What they saw was a kingdom that had a navy that was at least the equal of England's, and that a king who had a personal fortune greater than the personal fortune of any king in Europe at that point. But most important was the fact that Denmark dominated the Sound, dominated all the maritime passages that connected the Baltic to the North Sea. And England, just like the Netherlands, heavily depended upon the Baltic trade for all sorts of things, for grain, especially for naval stores in the case of England. Timber, especially mast timbers, pitch, tar, etc., all came from the Baltic. So the English trade to the Baltic was vital important to the English economy. And so the fact that Denmark essentially could turn on or turn off that trade like it's turning on or off a spigot meant that Denmark was going to be the relationship with Denmark would be important. And so when you look at the correspondence between England and Denmark, and the monarchies themselves tend to get along very, very well, but they're mostly arguing about trade issues. The English aren't happy with what the Danes are charging. The Danes are impounding English ships. The English are impounding Danish ships. I mean, it's a nonstop grievances. Never enough to really sour the relationship, but that's most of what the diplomatic correspondence is about. But on the other hand, since the reign of Frederik II of Denmark, he and Elizabeth I both saw themselves as kind of the center point of an international Protestant coalition that would have to guard Protestantism against an aggressive militant Catholicism. While that relationship got warm and cold, it's warm in the 1580s, for example. It cools off in the 1590s. It gets warm again in the 1620s. It's a big part of that relationship. The two see each other as vital partners in religious/confessional affairs in this very fraught period of religious warfare. So that's really the things. It's trade and religious identity are more important than anything else.
If you enjoy learning about the history of William Shakespeare and you want to go one step further to really experience the history for yourself, then consider joining Experience Shakespeare. This premium tier on Patreon lets you go behind the curtain and get hands-on with your history, trying out games, recipes, and crafts straight from the life of William Shakespeare. All of these activities are ones you can complete at home or in your classroom. And as a special bonus for joining our community of history lovers, you also get access to our exclusive library of virtual tours, animated plays, printable history guides, and special discounts on all the items in That Shakespeare Life shop. If you are ready to go beyond just learning and start experience Shakespeare's history for yourself, then join us today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and click on Experience Shakespeare. I'll see you inside. And now back to the show. Other real items that I think we tend to think if it shows up in Shakespeare's plays, it's probably fictional, but there's a lot of reality that shows up in Hamlet. And we mentioned Elsinore, Rosencrantz, Guildenstern, all have reflections in real historical moments. But something that surprised me was the fact that Hamlet attended the University of Wittenberg. This is a real place. And James, tell us about why Shakespeare might have chosen this university in particular to have Hamlet attend.
And that's a really good question. It's funny, I had an answer, and I still have the same answer for you, but when I revisited Paolo Rosenkrantz's article, and he thought this was remarkable that Shakespeare mentioned Wittenberg, because according to him, Danish nobles really didn't go to Wittenberg very often, and that's categorically wrong. Wittenberg was was the Lutheran Rome in a way. And Wittenberg was where Martin Luther taught. Wittenberg is where Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the door of the cathedral in 1517. This is Lutheran central. And while by Shakespeare's time, most Danish aspiring clergy and theologians go to the University of Copenhagen. Before then, the popular universities were Wittenberg and Rostock, but Wittenberg was seen as simply the best. I mean, this is where Martin Luther was and where Philip Melanchthon was. All the great figures in Lutheran and early Lutheranism were at Wittenberg. Claiming Wittenberg as their background is kind of a reflection that Shakespeare knew something about the cultural alignment of Denmark, because there's definitely an inclination to look towards Wittenberg in Denmark. But also, to me, the first thing I think of is that's Protestant identity. I mean, it's a way of signaling more than anything else. If these people went to Wittenberg, we're talking about real Protestants. Granted, this is a 16th, 17th century reference, and certainly not one that would be set in the distant past as Hamlet would be, but is definitely a signal of Protestant identity.
Well, what's the connection between Shakespeare's use of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in particular and the astronomer Tycho Brahe? Why do these things overlap?
Well, they overlap kind of accidentally, but I should point out at the same time that there's few Danes who are as well known. In fact, I'd say really there's only two Danes who are really known Europe-wide at the end of the 16th century, outside of the borders of their own country, and they would be, first of all, the theologian Niels Hemmingsen, and second, the astronomer slash aristocrat. We call him in Danish Tycho Brahe, but of course, very relatively few people refer to him by his Danish name instead as Tycho Brahe. But Tycho Brahe was extraordinarily well known, of course, and especially since his early writings was in 1572 about the supernova. That still bears his name. Brahe is extraordinarily well known throughout the world of learning in Europe. In fact, when James visits Denmark in the spring of 1590 with his new Danish bride, two people he makes a point of visiting are the theologian Niels Hemmingsen and Tycho Brahe. These are just simply the people in Denmark that he needs to talk to. Now, the connection is between Brahe and Gyldenstierne and Rosenkrantz is actually kind of a tenuous one. Not so much tenuous as peripheral, in the sense that Frederik Rosenkrantz, after he had been banished from Denmark, which in itself is an interesting story, the terms of his banishment included fighting against the Ottoman Turks in what today we call, what we refer to as the Habsburg hereditary lands. And he went down, I think, 1599 that he actually went in that direction. But in 1600, he actually accompanied, at Tycho Brahe's insistence, he actually accompanied Johannes Kepler as he traveled from Prague back to Vienna early on in 1600. And so Frederik Rosenkrantz and Tycho Brahe have that connection of sharing a journey together. But there's not a lot of other overlap, really, between the two.
We assume that Shakespeare was nodding to Denmark because of Anne of Denmark, James I's wife and queen. But are there any other cultural or political reasons that you would be able to shed light on for us that Shakespeare might have chosen to set this play in Denmark and to go to the trouble of calling out all of these details like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern as well as Wittenberg all by name? What are things that we should know about why this was so important to Shakespeare to do?
Okay, yeah, it's a good question. And I would argue on two levels. One of them, in a way, I'm kind of arguing out of my depth, but I know enough to at least make a point out of that, which is simply in terms of sources. I mean, obviously, the sources that Shakespeare used for the writing of Hamlet, whether it's the Ur-Hamlet or the various other similar tales that Shakespeare might have had some connection to, eventually we get to Saxo Grammaticus, the Danish medieval scholar, who related, among other things, the tale of Hamlet, of the Nordic prince who encounters goes through much the same kind of ordeal as Shakespeare's Hamlet, with some key distinctions, obviously. But the fact that there is, one of the sources that Shakespeare undoubtedly had at least indirect contact with was, in fact, a Danish source set in Denmark. So there's that, obviously. And the other thing is, I think overall, the cultural feeling between Denmark and England was generally a warm one, even despite the constant trade issues. That Denmark was, and I think that's one reason, for example, for both Elizabeth and for later on for James, and even later after that for Charles I, that when the kings of Denmark became difficult over trade issues, that there's always you can tell there's a certain feeling of betrayal on the part of the English. We're friends. Why are you treating us like this? That I think overall the inclination towards Denmark is one of trust and a certain amount of warmth. And certainly, I think it's safe to say that in diplomatic terms, that there weren't a lot of other places that those in charge in England could find the same kind of cordial relationship. But I think it's a combination of those things, and certainly the marriage alliance, the imminence of James's succession to the throne, and not long after, all played a role in Denmark being kind of a natural setting for this.
Well, obviously, there's a lot of Danish history worth unpacking in terms of understanding the play Hamlet and even having it be more vivid, I think, when you understand what was going on in the real relationships between England and Denmark at this time. It makes a lot of what Shakespeare writes just pop off of the stage for you. And you really are like, oh, that's why he did that. And I know that for a lot of us, we're new to this part of history, especially as it relates to Hamlet. So since you've done so much research into this area, can you recommend for us some additional resources that you would say, hey, if you're new, here's a great place to start studying this?
Yeah, there's three sources in particular that I'd like to point to. One of them, in fact, is and I'll make sure you have the information for this. An article from 2003 about the real Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. It has some issues with it, but it's a good basic introduction, I think, to the more particular questions here. As to the Anglo-Danish relation and more generally what's going on in Denmark at this point, because that's honestly, I've been working in Danish history since my mid-20s, since I was working on my PhD, and outside of Denmark, I always felt like I've had to, constantly say, hey, Denmark was important once too. Don't forget about Denmark, because it was significant at one point and now isn't. And as a result, historians still tend to see Denmark as kind of peripheral, even when we're talking about the period of time when Denmark clearly was not peripheral in European affairs. In terms of specific Anglo-Danish relations, the work of David Scott Gehring, teaches at the University of Nottingham, I think especially instructive. He did a book specifically on Anglo-Danish diplomacy in Elizabeth's reign. And in terms of general, Danish historians are beginning to write in English. They have been for a while, but most of their studies tend to be highly focused. I don't like to do a lot of self-plugging, but even when I teach Scandinavian history, I end up having to rely on at least something I've written myself. And so my book from 2007, Denmark 1513 to 1660, The Rise and Decline of a Renaissance Monarchy, is meant to be a general introduction to not just Denmark, but the entire Oldenburg states. It was Norway, Iceland, etc. During that period of time, how it became something like a great regional power and how it ultimately failed at that.
These are excellent resources, and we will link to them in the show notes for today's episode. So make sure you stay tuned for the podcast page for this week, where you can find all of that information and more on Paul's work as well. Now, Paul, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those. That's
very generous. I've given it some thought. I narrowed it down to 3, and I honestly can't go beyond. I have a hard time going beyond that. Somebody have to choose for me. And it would be, first of all, Joseph Heller's Catch-22, which I read once a year to remind myself that I'm sane. The first volume of Edward Gorey's Amphigory, which I realize is not very text heavy, but if you've ever seen Edward Gorey's illustrations, you'll appreciate that. And finally, probably my favorite book ever, next to Catch-22, Nursery Rhyme by Armand Decay. A weird little book, ridiculous little book, where Decay takes English language nursery rhymes, converts them into Middle French that sounds just like the English, and then he translates them into English, with annotation as if you discovered this ancient manuscript. And so it's a work, as one person put it, of philological hooliganism. I've read this book probably several times a year. I pull it out since I first bought it in 1985, and I still can't stop laughing at the thing, partially because it reminds me not to take what I do too seriously. Because the way that Decay takes these made-up nursery rhymes and then analyzes them like they're historical documents is absolutely brilliant.
So if you're a fan of intelligent mental calisthenics, you'll enjoy visiting Paul Douglas Lockhart on his deserted island, for sure. Well, what's next for you, Paul? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, the big project I'm working on now is a microhistory. In other words, we tell a very small story that tells us a much bigger story of a story that's very familiar to Danes, a story of the parson of Vejlby, who was a Danish Lutheran parson who was convicted and executed for a murder that happened in 1607, but probably never actually happened, and for which there was virtually no evidence to convict this parson of. And the next chapter of the story is where his son gets his vengeance by uncovering the plot against his father. It's a fascinating story. It is not pleasant. My first literary agent referred to it as proto-Nordic noir. At the end, nothing is resolved. Everything sucks, and most people die, or they're miserable, One of the two. It was made into a novel in Denmark in 1829. One of the Præsten i Vejlby is called, one of the most famous works in Danish literary history. But about a century ago, local historians uncovered the actual court records, and it's just a fascinating look into the lives of people who ordinarily don't get to speak much in history. Ordinary peasants, minor government functionaries, a country parson. That itself just makes it, to me, the story absolutely fascinating. So I've been working on this in my head now for 28 years as I've been doing other projects, and now I'm finally putting it down in book form.
Wow, talk about your historical cold case. Just when you think modern crime TV shows are creating their stories from scratch, you find out that Law and Order was happening over 400 years ago. That sounds so exciting. Remember, you can follow Paul's work and see when this publication is available, all in the show notes for today. Paul, thank you so much for being here this week and sharing our own little micro history story so we can see the role of Denmark in Shakespeare's life and understand how the history of that country and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern impacted Shakespeare's Hamlet. This has really been a fun conversation, and I appreciate you taking time to share it with us.
Oh, thank you for having me on, Cassidy. It's been a blast.
If you're as excited as I am about this 16th century Danish murder mystery that Paul was mentioning, you can find out more about his work along with the entire list of his recommended resources where you can dive in and explore the Danish history and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern from Shakespeare's lifetime, all packed into our podcast notes today. These are available at CassidyCash.com/EP405. While you're there, if you'd like to go inside the history with portraits, documents, and other period visuals related to Denmark's royal court and Shakespeare's Hamlet, then become a member of That Shakespeare Life by clicking Access the Extras, and all the bonuses will expand right there on the page. Experienced Shakespeare members can download the exclusive illustrated print of Elsinore Castle directly from the members' library, and all members can enjoy discounts on individual castle prints from our shop. So check all of that out at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife, or again, just click Access the Extras from our podcast page this week. As we step away from the glittering halls of Elsinore and back into our own lives this week, we can appreciate how Shakespeare's world was shaped not only by England's politics, but by the exchange of ideas, art, and diplomacy across Europe. Thank you so much for listening. A special thank you to our patrons. Your support makes this work possible and keeps the microphones running around here. It's a true joy to explore the life of William Shakespeare together, and I'm really grateful for this community that we share. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. Until next time, may your books be more than words, 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 and your college friends always bring good cheer instead of tragedy, and your curiosity be as endless as Hamlet's questions. That's it for this week. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.